Good afternoon. I am Ernst van Zyl, and I'm here as a representative of the civil rights organization AfriForum and our over 313,000 members. The Expropriation Bill should not pass because it will cause economic devastation, contribute towards a food security crisis, and enable human rights violations. Furthermore, various sections of the bill are unconstitutional and can and will be challenged in the courts, very likely successfully. If this bill were to become law, it will deprive citizens of their constitutional right to private property, and the destruction of the right to private property through this bill will have a very negative effect on foreign and domestic investment as well as job creation. This bill's purpose cannot be construed as to right the wrongs of the past. It only enables further wrongs to be committed in the present. And you cannot fill an old pothole by digging a new one. Detailed surveys and even the government's own reports and statistics repeatedly point to the same politically inconvenient truths, some of which I will share with you and put on the record here today. Number one. Politically inconvenient truth number one. The vast majority of people in South Africa regard the need for land reform as a very low priority. According to extensive polling, the number of South Africans who believe that more land reform will improve their lives currently stands at a mere 1%. The main three problems identified by these polls were employment, education, and crime. This comes as no surprise to anyone who is not increasingly disconnected and detached from the man on the street and the problems that he faces. Politically inconvenient truth fact number two. The so-called hunger for land that we often hear about in political rhetoric is largely a myth, particularly with regard to rural or agricultural land, and I'll explain why. South Africa is urbanizing at a rapid rate, not ruralizing. About 80% of all land claims were lodged in urban areas. It is also a well-documented fact that more than 90% of land claimants over the years declared that they would prefer money as compensation rather than the land to be restored to their ownership. This is according to the government's own admissions. The hunger that we see out there is not a hunger for land, but a hunger for jobs, a hunger for the end to corruption, a hunger for quality education, and a hunger for safe streets. That is the reality on the ground if you speak to normal South Africans that you encounter every day. Politically inconvenient fact number three. Over 66% or 2/3 of the country gets rainfall levels that are globally classified as semi or true desert. True desert areas such as the Karoo and Kalahari cover 55% of the land in South Africa, or approximately 66 million hectares. A province like the Northern Cape has almost no arable land relatively to the other provinces, but it is by far the largest province by total area, more specifically around 30% of SA's land area. Go look at the Northern Cape province, the largest province by far, on, for example, Google Earth. That would be my challenge to you afterwards. You will think that you're looking at the surface of Mars if you were to do so. Even better, go drive through that province. It will be, go drive through that province. I know it personally very well. I come from a long line of tough desert Afrikaners that have been farming in that province for many generations. Nobody except the most hardened farmers whose family have been living and farming in these harsh conditions for generations have any hunger to live there, let alone farm there. A significant amount of white-owned farmland is located in arid desert or semi-desert areas in the western part of the country, where the carrying capacity for livestock from natural grazing is significantly lower than in the eastern parts. These facts demonstrate how land statistics are more complex than just mere percentages. The government's land audits and politicians espousing land rhetoric do not take into account the agricultural potential of land, or I have not seen any proof of this. A province like the Northern Cape's massive land area and the nature of what it takes to successfully farm there strongly influences the national statistics regarding land ownership. Politically inconvenient fact number 4. Around 90% of land reform projects in South Africa have failed. And this is according to many authoritative sources. And commercial farms are converted into subsistence farms or squatter camps through this process. But why is that? Is the very, very important question. Because many of these projects these land reform projects were allocated to the politically connected who have no knowledge or experience of farming, or where they were allocated to people with knowledge or experience of farming, it was without any of the promised feed, seed, tractors, or other forms of support. These potential farmers were let down by empty government promises. They were doomed to fail from the start. They never stood a chance. And this trend continues to this day. Politically inconvenient fact number 5. All of the land that the government has acquired since the start of the land reform process, around only about 6% has been transferred to private ownership according to the latest statistics. The state owns approximately 17 million hectares of land, and that is the surface area, for perspective, of the provinces of KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga combined. Then you also need to take into account that another 8.36 million hectares is officially unaccounted for, although much of it is expected to be accounted for as government-owned land. That's another approximately Mpumalanga-sized chunk of land in the hands of the state. Can the government prove that it can redistribute some of the land that it has in its hands? The track record of the government gives us a resounding answer, and that answer is no. Redistributing land to ANC cadres or the politically connected does not count either. Politically inconvenient fact number 6. I've heard many politicians say that the land that will be prioritized for expropriation will be fallow land. Why is land often left unused or fallow by farmers? If you come from a farming community like I do, you know why. Because often land needs to be left to recover and regain its fertility instead of farming on it every year. Like I said, there's more than meets the eye to farming. It's complex business. If the government sees no problem with expropriating unused or fallow land, can the government also expropriate your savings, the money you're not currently using at the moment, or your clothes that you don't wear every week? Can that also be expropriated? According to this bill that says that any form of property can be expropriated, they might as well will be able to if it were to be passed into law. There is no evidence that this bill will empower the majority of South Africans or produce economic growth or jobs. The bill is the result of a set of ideologies that have been tested and failed horribly and repeatedly. History and our own Zimbabwean neighbors have shown us that tampering with private property rights, central planning, and excessive government control does not lead to economic growth nor to increased levels of equality. It always leads to the contrary. It always leads to economic decline, human rights violations, corruption, and greater inequality. Furthermore, expropriation without compensation violates international law. The European Court of Human Rights has held unequivocally that expropriation without market-related compensation will violate international human rights standards. A 2012 study of state practice by the UN Conference on Trade and Development stated that, and I quote, "Failure by a state to pay any compensation for a direct expropriation can be seen as rendering such expropriation unlawful," end quote. AfriForum demands that this bill not be passed and that the right to private property in this country be protected rather than destroyed. The existing land restitution process has been derailed by corruption, political greed, and mismanagement. Rather focus your time and energy on fixing that legitimate process of land restitution that is already in place. The problem is not the willing buyer, willing seller model. The problem is that the ANC government has proven itself to be an unwilling distributor of the land that it has hoarded. Due to the failures of the ANC government and rampant corruption, South Africa is currently experiencing an electricity crisis, an unemployment crisis, a crime crisis, an education crisis, and an open borders crisis. The expropriation bill will only add fuel to that fire, and that is an absolute guarantee. When Zimbabwe implemented its policy of expropriation without compensation, it led to the world's worst case of hyperinflation in history and the total collapse of that country's economy and agricultural sector. The average Zimbabwean was left destitute after the economy was destroyed, with millions fleeing and continuing to flee to South Africa, even though they have the land back home. That should tell you everything. But AfriForum is not an organization which only opposes destructive policies. We also provide carefully considered, sustainable solutions to actually bring about good and prosperity. Number one, expropriation of property without compensation is certainly not the answer. You don't solve an illness by taking a poison. Solution number two, the restitution process that is in place. South Africa has a history of land dispossession. Therefore, restitution process has already been put in place, which AfriForum supports. However, this legitimate process of addressing the wrongs of the past has been derailed by corruption and mismanagement. Fix that existing sufficient process. Solution number three, support. Government spent over 1.4 billion rand on buying farms in the Eastern Cape to redistribute. It was reported that of the 265 farms that were purchased, only 26 remain viable today. In 90% of those cases of once thriving farms that produced food and employment, they all lie in ruin now. This fact has been acknowledged by the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform. Farming is not easy. It is a technical job that requires significant amounts of time, expertise, experience, and money, as well as substantial support and training if you have no background in farming. Providing someone with the land to farm is no guarantee that that farm will succeed. They need support, experience, and proper training, and in that regard, the government has unequivocally failed. Solution number four, honesty about the facts. That's why I listed all the politically inconvenient facts here today in regards to this debate. Politicians need to stop injecting misinformation, half-truths, and outright lies into the land debate for political gain. This does not facilitate solutions. It only misinforms people, fuels division and conflict, and muddies the waters. It's shameful and should not be tolerated at all. Solution number five, protect the constitutional right to private property. Countless studies show that the protection and enforcement of private property is one of the key factors which facilitates economic growth, job creation, investment, both foreign and domestic, and political stability. Many case studies show that the destruction of private property rights has exactly the opposite effect on these metrics. Expropriation without compensation is state-sanctioned theft. It is legalized looting, deeply immoral, and a human rights violation. Yes, yes, this is in fact my conclusion. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. It is an inhumane, ill-conceived policy motivated by a combination of corrupt greed, ideological possession, cynical electioneering, and a philosophy of revenge. The government is gearing up to violate the rights of millions of South Africans and cause an economic disaster, and therefore the resistance to this bill is so strong and growing. That is why this bill cannot pass. Baie dankie. Thank you very much. Kia leboga.